Hello, I'm Phil McCarthy, and I want to welcome you to the 15th Annual McCarthey Family Foundation Lecture Series. As you can tell with that mask on, things are a little bit different this year, but we'd love to tell you the same things that we have always said, the importance of independent journalism, especially in a democracy. A little over a year ago, as we were having this event, when John Meacham spoke, the person who is occupying the Oval Office, which would be the highest elected office man has ever designed for the common folk to participate in, issued a statement that said, "The free press is the enemy of the people." Well, immediately, our friends at the Boston Globe took offense to that. They ran a national campaign and they joined with us, that is the Boston Globe Foundation, the McCarthey Family Foundation, to put together and expand our annual essay contest. So this year, besides just our students in Utah, we asked students all over the country to participate. And the person who is most responsible for that is the opinion and editorial page deputy editor, Marjorie Pritchard. Marjorie, we're delighted to have you join us. We're sorry that we were not able to be together like we were last year, but Marjorie, tell us a little bit why you think this is such an important project. Let's hear from Marjorie.
Thank you, Phil. Good evening, I'm Marjorie Pritchard. And as Phil just mentioned, the Globe spearheaded the Free Press campaign. We made a pitch to other newspapers in response to the president's attacks. And when we went to press just 10 days later, more than 420 publications stood tall and stood together in defending a fundamental pillar of our democracy. We are not fake news. We are not the enemy of the people. We're just journalists doing our job. But the president's attacks come at a time when public trust in journalism is eroding. And one way to restore that trust is through education and engagement of future generations. Globe Opinion and the Boston Globe Foundation teamed up with the McCarthey Family Foundation to sponsor a national student essay contest on the importance of a free press. More than 200 students participated. Their essays were lively, they were engaging, and all of them were concerned about these threats against the press. These are our future leaders. They are now picking up the torch, and I have no doubt that they will continue to defend the First Amendment. So let's get to the winners. Each will receive a $5,000 award from the Boston Globe Foundation. In the university category, Allie Sullivan from the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. For grades 9 through 12, Annalise Best from Frisco Liberty High School in Frisco, Texas. In grades 6 through 8, Eric Liu, an 8th grader at West High School in Salt Lake City. There's one added award. It's the winner of the popular vote. The recipient gets $1,000 from the Mary Kay Lazarus Public Relations. And that goes to Marcus Lewis Jr., an 8th grader at Rodeo Palms Junior High School in Rosharon, Texas. Congratulations to all. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep standing up for the First Amendment.
Marjorie, thank you for those great words, and congratulations to our 3 essay winners. I also wanted to say thank you to all of those students who participated, and also give a special heads up and thank you to all of the teachers who inspired so many young people, whether you were a middle schooler, a high schooler, or a collegiate student, to participate in this national contest. Again, congratulations to the winners, and thank you all. Now, we actually do have a very special thing. As we mentioned earlier, the local media, especially the print media, sadly declined to participate in this important event. However, there was one person and one institution locally who really answered the bell. President Beth Dobkin and our friends at Westminster College. Not only did they encourage many students to participate in the essay contest, they also offered a 4-year full scholarship to Westminster College. We are very grateful for their input. We're very thankful for all that they do. Now, let's hear a little bit more and meet President Beth Dobkin and our friends at Westminster College.
At Westminster College, we bring students together in communities where they learn the freedom to think, the wisdom to know, and the aptitude to act. Particularly now, in a time of great unrest, with a pandemic, protests, election, and global climate change, There is no more important time to focus conversations and critical reflection on understanding the crucial relationships among the First Amendment, a free press, and the foundations of democracy. As the president of Westminster College, it is my honor to announce the national winner of the high school essay and the recipient of a scholarship to Westminster College in Salt Lake City. Congratulations to Annalise Best, a senior at Frisco Liberty High School in Frisco, Texas. Ms. Best examined how authoritarian leaders recognize the power of the press and try to suppress it. She wrote that her coming of age has unfolded alongside American turmoil. In developing her own opinions and searching for her own beliefs, values, and truth, she came to believe that a free press has always acted as a defense system for our democratic freedoms. I welcome Annalise to Westminster, where her academic experiences will challenge her to think freely, develop her passions and convictions, and prepare her for a life of influence and impact. Congratulations again to Annalise Best, and thank you to the McCarthey Foundation for its dedication to democracy.
Beth, thank you and all of our friends at Westminster College. This is a great inspiration and a terrific thing you have done. Now, let's learn a little bit more about our local essay contest. We are going to introduce the chair and the vice chair of our Utah jury, and that's Dr. Sarah McCarthey, professor at the University of Illinois, and Tom McCarthy, longtime deputy editor of our local Salt Lake Tribune. They will tell us a little bit about our local winners, and again, thank you all for participating. Let's hear from Sarah and Tom McCarthy.
Thank you, Phil. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be part of the essay contest. And first, I'd like to thank our outstanding members of the jury who take time to read these excellent essays and labor over the rankings. The members of the jury are Tommy McCarthy, Vice Chair, Lois Collins, Mary Dixon, Les Hemphill, Nancy Mielich, and Terry Orm. I'd also like to give special thanks to Robert Austin. He's Specialist of International Initiatives and Social Studies at the Utah State Board of Education. We'd like to thank him for his generous support of the competition, which prompted many teachers to assign essays on the topic. The broad reach of the Foundation's mission and message is evident, not only in the winners, but it's evident in the background, geography, and types of schools they attend. Private, public, charter, and even homeschooling that are represented in the 2020 submissions. Now I'll introduce my brother Tommy, who will announce the winners.
Good evening. Welcome to the annual McCarthey Lecture Series. I have the honor of announcing the 2020 McCarthey Family Foundation essay winners. The broad reach of our mission really hit home this time as the students stepped up their game when it came to expressing their thoughts on freedom of the press. The passion, research, and care put forth by the students warmed my heart. So the winners are Jerry Joseph, Draper Park Middle School. His essay is entitled, The Importance of Freedom of the Press. Jerry wrote that
freedom of the press in our country informs us during dark and difficult times. It also empowers us to act and do something about issues affecting our families, friends, and communities.
Our second winner, Arundhati Oman from West High School, titled her essay, The Sanctity of the Press.
The only thing standing in between an informed and uninformed voter is the press themselves.
And finally, Christopher F. Melling, a second-year student at the J. Reuben Clark Law School, Brigham Young University. Christopher argues that
attacks against President Trump actually proves our press's freedom.
So Jerry, our youngest, will receive a check for $1,500. Dottie, a check for $2,500. And finally, Christopher, a check for $4,000. I'd like to thank all of our essay contestants. It was a fabulous year.
Thank you, Tom and Sarah. Thank you again for heading up this local jury as we read these amazing essays from these young people. You know, the commitment, the passion that we read in so many of these essays, leads us to know that we will have a great future. Again, congratulations to our winners, and thank you to all of those who participated. And one more time, I want to say thank you to all of the educators who helped make this possible. You know, nobody really cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Thank you for caring so much and inspiring so many students to participate. Now, let's get on with our main event, so to speak. Tonight's speaker, Jane Mayer, lives in Washington, D.C. She's a native New Yorker, but she's a Yale grad. Jane is best known for many of her books, including Dark Money, The Secret Influence of Billionaires. And now she's recently working on an article on Ms. Guilfoyle that a lot of people have not been crazy about because she's really stirred a bit of a hornet's nest. I had the opportunity to speak with Jane, and I said, is there anything that most people don't know about you? We can read your bio. We know you grew up in New York. You went to Yale. You've been at the New Yorker for some time. You live in Washington, D.C. You've received many awards. She said, well, there is one thing that a lot of people don't know, and that is I really started out, my dream in life was to be a cartoonist. And I said, well, what happened with that? She said, ultimately, I found out I couldn't really make a living as a cartoonist, so I decided I should be a little bit more of a serious journalist. So the first female White House correspondent, she also spent time in Germany and was there when the Berlin Wall fell. Without further ado, let's hear from tonight's special speaker, Jane Mayer. After Jane has given her speech, we will have questions and answers as we traditionally do for Rowland Hall students. So after Jane speaks, we will have a little Q&A, so please stay tuned for that. Jane, let's hear from you and then the students. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here with you, even if it has to be virtually from my home in Washington, D.C., through the miracles of Zoom. Before anything else, I want to first thank the McCarthey family for making this possible. It's a tremendous honor to be chosen to give the 15th annual McCarthey Family Foundation lecture, and I'm so grateful for their generous commitment to the role of independent journalism in our society. When we started discussing this talk months ago, we picked the weekend after the election, thinking it would be a perfect moment to reflect back on the national political scene. I figured that since the election would be decided on Tuesday, November 3rd, I'd have plenty of time to analyze the outcome by the time the weekend rolled around and to write a brilliantly thoughtful speech. Well, we were in for a surprise. Hopefully, the outcome will be decided before the next presidential election. Luckily, though, as a longtime reporter, I'm used to working on tight deadlines and winging it as best I can. So I hope you'll bear with me as I try to make sense of a hugely important turning point in American politics before all the returns are fully in. If the courts overturn the whole thing and negate everything I have to say, I also hope you'll chalk it up to journalism being a very rough draft of history and have me back for a sequel. Now, ordinarily, I cover VIP addresses like this rather than giving them. At the Wall Street Journal, where I covered Ronald Reagan as the paper's first female White House correspondent, reporters were chastened to shine the spotlight on others rather than on ourselves. In fact, there was an unwritten rule at the paper when I joined it. The only time a reporter was allowed to use the first person pronoun I was if the rest of the sentence ended with the words, "was shot in the groin." Hopefully, that won't be necessary tonight. But before we get going, I do want to issue a disclaimer of sorts. I'm not here as a combatant in a political war, or even as a pundit with all the answers to the many alarming political questions we're facing at this moment. I am here as a news reporter to bring you some thoughts from the front lines of Washington, where I've lived and worked as a political reporter for most of the past 35 years. When I came to Washington in 1984, I was just a few years out of college and fresh off covering the bombing of the US Marine barracks in Beirut, where I witnessed one of the first nightmarish acts of Islamic terrorism against America. It's fair to say that I knew almost nothing about national politics other than what I'd learned as a history major at Yale. To be honest, I suspect that the only reason that the Wall Street Journal sent me to the White House was that by 1984, it had gotten kind of embarrassing that there had been so few female reporters at the paper. So I was probably an early beneficiary of affirmative action. It turned out to be a great advantage because I soon discovered that Reagan, who was then president, had a thing about calling on women in red dresses during press conferences, and that he literally would look right for me and say, "You there, the little girl in red." After almost 4 decades and 5 presidents later, I still have many more questions than answers. And I go to work every day with a keen sense of how much I still don't know. Anyone who has worked with the New Yorker's ace team of fact checkers cannot help but stay humble as they ferret out one humiliating error after another to keep us from falling flat on our faces in print. And so while I want to talk to you tonight about the war on truth in an era of fake news and alternative facts, the first thing I'd like to say is that neither I nor anyone else I know has an absolute lock on the truth. As Carl Bernstein, who was one of the best investigative journalists of our era, has put it, the most a reporter can do is to convey the best obtainable version of the truth at any given moment. Some days we get closer than others. But while I make no claims to possess the absolute truth, I do know that I've never been more worried about its ability to break through than I am tonight. 4 days after America's 2020 presidential election, we are in an almost unimaginable place. For the first time in our history, the President of the United States is trying to delegitimize a national election. For months, he has claimed that the only way he could lose was if the election were rigged. It seems unfathomable, but now he has gone ahead and claimed the election was stolen. He has sent squads of lawyers to court, alleging that there was some kind of election fraud and that he is being robbed of what should be his rightful second term. He declared from the podium of the White House briefing room on Thursday that, quote, "If you count the legal votes, I easily win. They're trying to rig an election," he told the country, "and we can't let it happen." Soon, his false claim was being spread virally through Facebook and other social media platforms to millions of Americans under the hashtag #StopTheSteal. Few experts in election law, including those sympathetic to President Trump, take his arguments seriously or give his team's lawsuits much chance of succeeding. One law professor derided his inconsistency, noting that he was demanding that we recount Wisconsin, stop counting in North Carolina, count faster in Nevada, count backwards in Pennsylvania, count just the ballots he likes in Georgia, and don't count Detroit. But regardless of the absurdity of these allegations, coming from a sitting president of the United States, the most powerful man in the country and perhaps the world, these are astonishingly serious and deeply disturbing claims. In journalism, editors always warn reporters not to use the word unprecedented because there always turns out to be some kind of earlier example, as well as a learned historian or a pesky reader to point it out. But in the case of the 2020 election, we really are in uncharted territory. What I'd like to talk to you tonight about is how we got here. How has it come to pass that nearly half the electorate, almost 70 million voters, appear to believe or at least embrace the fictional charges being levied by President Trump, while rejecting and often demonizing the work of independent, fact-based journalists, as well as all other manner of independent authorities, including the scientists fighting COVID-19. If the election has shown us anything, it is that there seem to be two different Americas inhabiting the same country, not with just their own sets of beliefs, but with their own sets of facts. The country is deeply and dangerously, epistemologically divided. It's tempting to ascribe the extraordinary situation to the uniqueness of Donald Trump. But I hope to explain that the war on truth actually goes back long before he took the national stage. And while it has been greatly exacerbated by Donald Trump, we won't be able to remedy it unless we address its deeper root causes. Among them is the oversized role of money in American politics that has enabled a group of private political donors whose views are far more extreme than those of the country at large to distort the debate and manipulate public opinion with divisive and often bogus information. I will get back to that backstory in a moment, but first it must be acknowledged that Trump certainly has exploited the weaknesses in our democratic institutions and attacked the truth and those who tell it like no other president. His claims of election fraud, which appear to be utterly baseless, are just the latest in a long string of incendiary misstatements. By the end of this past August, the Washington Post had counted more than 22,000 false or misleading statements that President Trump had made over the previous 4 years, including 189 on one single day in August. He was by then averaging approximately 50 lies a day. The New York Times' chief White House correspondent, Peter Baker, recently went so far as to declare that dishonesty has been a defining hallmark of the Trump presidency. To some extent, the problem would be almost comic if it weren't so serious. Take election night this past week. At 2 a.m, Trump appeared in the East Room to declare that he'd already won. As he made his premature claim, the television chyrons beneath his image showed Biden with 238 electoral college votes and Trump trailing at 213, confronting the American public with the dilemma that Groucho Marx once famously posed. Who are you going to believe, me or your eyes? Lying in high office, of course, didn't begin with President Trump, but as Jonathan Rauch, a fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, has observed, President Trump lies not only prolifically and shamelessly, but in a different way from previous presidents and national politicians. They may spin the truth or bend it or break it, but they pay homage to it and regard it as a boundary. In contrast, President Trump has lied purposefully and strategically. His message, it seems, is that he is more powerful than the facts. Reality, as Rauch wrote, is whatever he can get away with. In denying evidence-based reality, Trump is not just contradicting whatever particular fact is at hand, he's also undermining the time-honored methodology of research that we inherited from the Enlightenment, in which rather than relying on priests or kings or other self-appointed savants, we search for the truth with open minds by testing hypotheses, gathering evidence, grappling honestly with contradictions, and acknowledging gaps. This has basically been the process I've tried to employ in pursuit of the truth as a journalist, and that I imagine many of you employ in your work and your studies every day. It's because we in the press value this approach so deeply that we've risen to take the bait from Trump so often. His casual disregard for what's true is an attack on our shared system of knowledge, which is the basic building block of our democracy. Now, I learned about Trump's disregard for the truth firsthand, even before he was elected. During the 2016 campaign, I wrote a piece about Tony Schwartz, the ghostwriter of The Art of the Deal, and the best-selling book that launched Trump's reputation nationally as an ostensibly super successful businessman, which itself was a lie. When I interviewed Schwartz, he hadn't spoken to anyone about Trump for nearly 3 decades, but he watched as Trump ran and became increasingly alarmed and very much wanted to warn the country about who Trump really was. Schwartz told me that Trump lied strategically. He told me that Trump had what he described as a complete lack of conscience about it. Since most people are constrained by the truth, it gave Trump a strange advantage, Schwartz said. Trump had admitted to Schwartz that he told people what they wanted to hear, whether it was true or not, if it helped serve his own purposes. Trump, for instance, confessed that he had faked work at what was actually an abandoned construction site to fool business partners. And he shamelessly advertised Trump Tower as having 68 floors when it only had 58. In The Art of the Deal, Schwartz invented a phrase which Trump loved to explain these chronic falsehoods. Schwartz called the Trump statements truthful hyperbole and claimed they were an innocent form of exaggeration. But in retrospect, Schwartz admitted to me that he had come to believe that the fabrications weren't innocent at all. Truthful hyperbole, he told me, was just another word for a lie, but told in the spirit of who cares? Schwartz was full of remorse that he had, as he put it, put lipstick on a pig. While reporting that story, I experienced a few of Trump's lies firsthand. Despite his ostensible distaste for the media, Trump was actually far more accessible than most modern presidential candidates. It was almost impossible to get an interview with Hillary Clinton during the last campaign. But when I wanted to interview Trump for that story, I just sent a couple of email requests, and before long, my phone was ringing and Trump was on the line. I love The New Yorker, he confided in that now familiar husky purr. Great magazine. He also said he loved Tony Schwartz, the ghostwriter of his book, until I told him that I didn't think Schwartz, who had described Trump to me as a sociopath, would be voting for him. Is that right? Trump said, the tenor of his voice changing. That is so disloyal. He probably thinks it's going to be good for him, but he's going to find out it's not going to be good for him. A few minutes after Trump hung up, my phone rang again, and this time it was Tony Schwartz. Jane, he said, did you tell Donald Trump I wasn't going to vote for him? Yes, I admitted. It's true, right? Trump, it turned out, had immediately called Schwartz after getting off the line with me, even though they hadn't spoke for nearly 30 years. Trump tracked him down and reamed Schwartz out, telling him that a reporter from The New Yorker told him that Schwartz wasn't going to be voting for him. And then, without missing a beat, he totally dropped the flattery and added in vintage Trump style, and by the way, The New Yorker is a failing magazine that nobody reads. So much for truthful hyperbole. Few paid it much attention, but Trump actually launched his national political career by pushing the racially charged lie on Fox News way back in 2011 that Barack Obama hadn't been born in the United States. It marked an important shift in the tone at Fox. Until then, Rupert Murdoch's network had largely mocked birtherism as an unhinged conspiracy theory. Murdoch himself was an immigrant and didn't at first have much patience for Trump's hate-tinged nativism, but it began to catch on with viewers and with Fox's primetime host, Sean Hannity, all of which were signs of things to come. As the former Fox TV correspondent Greta Van Susteren told me, when I did a piece about Fox last year, Murdoch is about making money. And even though he reportedly derided Trump behind the president's back as a quote unquote blanking idiot, Murdoch saw a gold mine in Trump for Fox. So did a lot of other media outlets, including CNN, which more or less handed its airwaves to Trump during the 2016 campaign, allowing him to address the viewers live for huge swaths of time, basically without editing or factual correction. By 2016, when I was covering Trump, I sensed a palpable change across the land. I'd been covering presidential elections since 1984 and had a basic confidence that if the media conveyed the facts, most of the country would absorb them. At national outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, there was an amazing feeling when you wrote an important story. It ricocheted from one news outlet to the next, sometimes around the world. But that year, important news seemed to wither and die. Meanwhile, a number of people I interviewed seemed infected by bizarre disinformation. I remember one woman who said she couldn't vote for Clinton because Hillary and Bill were at 26. I asked, 26 what? Murders, she answered. She wasn't an isolated case. Quack theories, such as the Pizzagate conspiracy, were coursing virally through the body politic, and many voters seemed to have just about no immunity. These were extreme examples, but the problem was widespread. A study showed that over 40% of the Americans who got their information primarily from Fox News in 2016 believed that Obama wasn't born in the United States. Trump's war on the truth, of course, was visible from the first day in the White House. Shortly after taking the oath of office on January 20th, 2017, the newly sworn-in president commanded his press secretary at the time, Sean Spicer, to tell a demonstrable lie, claiming that Trump's inaugural crowd was larger than that of his predecessor. It was at that point that Kellyanne Conway, the counselor to the new president, explained that despite photographic proof to the contrary, the Trump administration had alternative facts. Although the dispute at hand was small and petty, the skirmish represented a much bigger and more prophetic clash. As Chuck Todd, the NBC News anchor interviewing Conway at the time, reported, although alternative facts are not facts, they are falsehoods. The fib about the size of the inaugural crowd was only the start. When I interviewed Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic Speaker of the House, she described how Trump falsely claimed to her during their first meeting that he had won the popular vote. In what would become a pattern, none of the Republican officials in the room corrected him. She tried, but there have been many more lies and much worse ones since. Trump has claimed to have done more for Black Americans than Lincoln and accomplished more in his first 100 days than Franklin Roosevelt. He claimed falsely that Obama had tapped his phones and that he had a better, cheaper health care plan that would protect Americans with pre-existing medical conditions, and that the coronavirus would be gone by Easter. In reality, in one day this past week, there were 104,000 new cases of COVID-19 in this country, and more than 234,000 Americans have died. As political reporters, we're used to a lot of baloney from those in office, but this is the first time that, as Jonathan Rauch put it, the White House virtually became a baloney factory. Cumulatively, the level of disinformation that has emanated from the highest rungs of our political hierarchy has been tantamount to a war on the country's ability to distinguish fact from fiction. As Michael Hayden, the former CIA director, told the Washington Post, "We have in the past argued over the values to be applied to objective reality, or occasionally over what constituted objective reality, but never have we questioned the existence or relevance of objective reality itself. These truly are uncharted waters in this country." The impact, as many experts in totalitarianism have written, has been a confused, cynical, and divided public. Hannah Arendt famously observed in her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, that the ideal subject for totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and true and false no longer exist. When those lines are blurred, citizens, she wrote, begin to think that anything is possible and nothing is true. It effectively undermines the public's will to figure out what's real, and by doing so, it diminishes any check on those in power. These tactics are not original to Trump. Attacks on the truth and on those who tell it have been launched by anti-democratic regimes all around the world. Stalin called those he banished to the gulags enemies of the people, and Hitler's followers denounced the media as the Lügenpresse, or lying press. But while many American presidents have been aggravated by the press, and some, such as Richard Nixon, have used the media as a useful political foil, Trump's relentless vilification of independent journalism has been of a different order of magnitude, according to Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, the authors of How Democracies Die. Trump has called members of the American media the most dishonest people on earth. He has done everything he can to undermine the public's faith in its credibility and faith in its motives, calling factual accounts fake news, and like Stalin, calling those who write them the enemies of the American people. I actually interviewed the Trump advisor who gave the president the idea of using that phrase. At first, Trump had been calling the press his enemies, but the advisor, the late Pat Caddell, a Harvard graduate who knew exactly how incendiary it would be, suggested to Trump that he instead call the press the enemies of the American people. That way, Trump could turn his private grievance into a national campaign against perceived elites. Trump immediately loved the idea. He turned to his son-in-law and said, "Jared, get a pen, write that down." And from that moment on, the phrase became his constant refrain. Trump has used his bully pulpit to stigmatize anyone who holds him to account, including individual reporters. He's tried to illegally strip CNN's Jim Acosta of his White House press pass, and he's nastily demeaned many other reporters, including a disproportionate number of women of color, simply for doing their jobs. He's also threatened to, as he put it, open up the libel laws, and threatened Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon and the Washington Post, with an antitrust action, tweeting during the campaign that if I become president, this is back in 2016, oh, do they have problems. And as I reported in the story about Fox News, Trump tried to improperly pressure the Justice Department to block a merger between AT&T and Time Warner, a move that would have hurt CNN, whose coverage he hates, and helped its more pro-Trump rival, Fox News. I've actually been there in the press section at a Trump rally when the president pointed at me and a handful of other working journalists and denounced us literally as human scum. An entire sports arena filled with our fellow citizens roared with jeers. I may be perverse, but I found it almost funny. It was so juvenile, but really, it's not funny. It's an attack on the free press, an attack on the Constitution, and a threat to democracy. But the president's targets have ranged far beyond mere journalists. All manner of independent fact-based experts who have held him accountable have come under attack, ranging from the economic analyses by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and the assessments by the country's own intelligence agencies to the scientific community. He began the 2016 campaign by demeaning the science of climate change as a hoax and that he said was perpetrated by the Chinese. And more recently, he's denigrated the country's public health officials and doctors as they struggle heroically to deal with the deadly coronavirus outbreak, including America's revered chief epidemiologist, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Falsehoods uttered by politicians are, of course, nothing new. What is new, however, is the amplification of these lies by new forms of social media. Overtly partisan, frequently false, and often viciously personal attacks are now spread virally and unfiltered by countless waves of trolls, bots, tweets, and bad faith bloggers. It's apparently apocryphal that Mark Twain ever really said, "A lie goes halfway around the world before the truth pulls its boots on." But whatever the derivation, today, a lie can spread, not just halfway around the world, but entirely around the globe in minutes. And often the truth stands almost no chance of catching up. As a result, large swaths of the population are basically being purposefully and constantly misled. Social media, especially Facebook, can circulate false information to 2 billion people each day. And any crackpot organization or bigoted hater can now use the same tools as seasoned reporters to distribute false information globally. The careful research of scholars and scrupulous investigative work of journalists can be overpowered by a handful of keyboard clicks. A technology that holds the great promise of connecting people also has great destructive power to misinform and divide them. Humanity has never before had an instant information distribution technology of such force. It's been compared to the seismic impact of Gutenberg. Our political system is reeling from the blow. Charles Sykes, the former right-wing talk radio host, has described the fallout well. The cumulative effect of the attacks on fact-based media, he has said, has been to delegitimize those outlets and essentially destroy much of the right's immunity to false information. He added, all administrations lie, but what we are seeing here is an attack on credibility itself. It's tempting, as I said at the outset, to ascribe the war on truth to Trump, but it didn't start with him, and importantly, unless we reckon with that, it won't end with him. There are many causes of the fix that we're in now, but one backstory that I've reported on implicates two of the country's largest and most secretive political donors, the Koch brothers, who I would argue helped set the table for the current mess by using their fortunes, starting 40 years ago, to subsidize an ideological assembly line aimed at creating alternative facts. It's worth knowing a little about the Kochs to understand how and why they and their movement achieved such influence. I stumbled across them almost accidentally. You can't really cover politics in America without following the money, as Deep Throat told Woodward and Bernstein to do back in the Watergate days. And if you follow the money hard enough, you're going to come across the Kochs. As their own top political lieutenant, a man aptly named Richard Fink, boasted a couple years ago, you can't turn over any rock in American politics without finding us underneath it. For decades, the brothers poured an extraordinary and probably unprecedented amount of money into American politics, derived from their business, Koch Industries, a Kansas-based oil and gas and chemical conglomerate that is reportedly the largest private company in America. Before David Koch died last year at the age of 79, the two brothers' fortune was valued at some $120 billion, making them together worth more than Jeff Bezos and more than Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft. But while their net worth was spectacular, their most important legacy was their impact on American politics. For 4 decades, these two relatively unknown brothers were the primary sponsors of libertarianism in America and of the Republican Party's takeover by economic radicals determined to slash taxes on corporations and the wealthy and starve government programs, particularly in the areas of the social safety net and environmental protection. As libertarian true believers, the Kochs pushed these policies as beneficial to all, but without a doubt, they were good for the Kochs. My book, Dark Money, tells their story. Their father, Fred Koch, who grew up in a small town in Texas, developed a new process for refining oil. But when he was unable to sell it in America, he shopped it elsewhere in the world. Interestingly, the first place Fred Koch ended up succeeding after looking for foreign markets was the communist Soviet Union. He built refineries for Joseph Stalin, and after the Russians figured out how to copy his blueprints, he then sought new markets, which is how he ended up building a refinery for Adolf Hitler. The German refinery, which was completed in 1935 after Hitler personally greenlighted it, was uniquely capable of producing the fuel needed by the Nazi air fleet, and so became hugely important to Hitler's war machine, according to historians that I interviewed. This is not to say that Fred Koch was a Nazi. He was a hard-driving businessman in search of his fortune wherever he could make it. According to several who knew him, Fred Koch felt deeply guilty about his work for Stalin in particular, and back in Kansas, he became one of the founding members of the virulently right-wing, anti-communist John Birch Society, passing on an almost phobic hatred of centralized government to his sons. The family's beliefs were so far out on the fringe, even William F. Buckley, the conservative icon, called their strain of anti-government politics anarcho-totalitarianism. In fact, Fred Koch was considered such a kook in his day, the FBI kept a file on him as a potentially dangerous radical. Given this, it's not surprising that other members of the John Birch Society, the Kochs preferred to operate outside of the public eye. Charles Koch, the second of the four boys, was especially driven and ambitious. He and his brother David shared their father's political views, joining the John Birch Society too. At first, they tried to gain power in the usual way by running for office, but their ideas were so far to the right of the American mainstream, they soon gave up. In 1980, Charles Koch got David to run for the vice presidency of the United States on the Libertarian Party ticket. The aim was to run against Ronald Reagan from the right, because the Kochs thought that Reagan was too liberal. By the time it was done, David spent almost $2 million of his own on his own candidacy and failed miserably. The Libertarians got less than 1% of the vote that year. It's not surprising that they lost when you look at their platform. They were running on a promise to practically abolish the federal government. The Kochs, who were fans of the Austrian economic school of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, believed that the only legitimate role for the federal government was to safeguard private property. All other government expenditures, from their standpoint, were akin to socialism or the creeping communism that their father had taught them to revile. The government, as one of Charles's mentors, Robert Lefevre, put it, was a disease masquerading as its own cure. The 1980 Libertarian Party platform therefore called for the abolition of virtually every modern social program, including Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, as well as getting rid of the FBI, the CIA, the EPA, and the SEC. They also wanted to eradicate the government-run public school system and abolish all federal income and corporate taxes, which they portrayed as a form of theft. Their aim, according to Brian Doherty, a sympathetic fellow libertarian who interviewed the Kochs for his history of the movement, was, as he put it, radical. They didn't want to just prune the government. They wanted, as they said, to pull it out by the roots. 40 years ago, it's safe to say that this view was not widely shared. There was a pretty solid bipartisan consensus in post-World War II America that a powerful and activist government was a force for good. What has fascinated me, though, is that just 4 decades later, the Libertarian Party platform that was such a disastrous flop in 1980 that it was almost a joke, can be seen as a template for the Republican Party and to a great extent the Trump administration today. We've had an EPA commissioner who wanted, in essence, to abolish the EPA, weakening regulations and handing huge swaths of protected public lands over to private energy companies, ideas that are manifestly unpopular with the American public. We had a labor secretary who wanted to undermine organized labor. We had a Secretary of Education who wanted to supplant the public school system with weakly regulated charter schools. We also had a Secretary of Health and Human Services who wanted to kill the Affordable Care Act. And we had a Republican Party that drastically slashed taxes for corporations and the wealthy, despite polls showing that the public favored neither. We also have had a Federal Elections Commission that doesn't at the moment even have a minimum number of commissioners necessary to enforce the laws that are supposed to police the record amount of money flowing into American elections. In other words, despite the unpopularity of their extreme views, the Kochs somehow largely won. So what happened? One part of the answer is that when the Kochs' ideas proved too unpopular to win at the ballot box back in 1980, they were faced with a political conundrum. How could they advance their agenda in a democracy when their views were opposed by the majority of Americans? Instead of giving up, they devised a different route to power. Charles Koch, according to Doherty, decided that politicians were just actors, reading from scripts. Instead of running for office, at this point, the Kochs decided it would be smarter to actually supply the themes and the words for the scripts. And so, starting at least as early as 1980, they began strategically funding efforts at almost every level to transform America along the lines of their own ultra-free market, anti-tax, and limited government ideology, not from center stage as public candidates, but from the wings as big and often secret financial donors. Both Charles and David Koch were bright and well-educated. They both had undergraduate and graduate engineering degrees from MIT, and in many ways, they approached the takeover of American politics as an engineering challenge. Much of what they funded was the ideological equivalent of a factory. They approached the manufacture of political change like any other product. To achieve it, they followed a three-step process laid out in a paper they called The Structure of Social Change. Key to their effort was a blueprint drafted by the former Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell before he became a Supreme Court Justice in 1971, calling corporate America to arms. Powell warned that capitalism in America faced an existential threat. The enemy wasn't so much the anti-war protesters and hippies in the streets at the time. It was, he said, the liberal intelligentsia, represented by the news media, the universities, the sciences, the courts, and the clergy. Charles Koch and his brother launched an epic attack on public opinion by subsidizing the production of their own. Most of this was achieved through the creation of an array of interconnecting nonprofit groups, many of which were built with tax-deductible donations. The first phase called for investing in like-minded intellectuals whose ideas would serve as raw products. Currently, the Kochs fund libertarian programs in over 350 colleges and universities. The second phase required investing in think tanks, such as the Cato Institute in Washington, which the Kochs founded, that would turn these raw ideas into marketable policies. And the third phase called for the creation of popular support, in part by funding what were supposed to look like grassroots citizens groups that would pressure elected officials into enacting the Kochs policies. The best known of these Koch-run political advocacy groups today is Americans for Prosperity. Technically, it's defined as an apolitical nonprofit group, but it acts as the political arm of the corporate right. In fact, Americans for Prosperity has, according to several studies, grown so powerful it now rivals and has in some respects subsumed the old line Republican Party. In 2016, it had a bigger payroll than the Republican National Committee. It paid 1,600 staffers in 35 states and boasted that its operation covered 80% of the US population. In the view of two Harvard scholars, Theda Skocpol and Alexander Hertel Fernandez, it had become an unparalleled and unprecedented private political machine. Truly, nothing like this had existed in American politics before. Adding to this weaponized philanthropy, as I call it in my book, dark money, particularly after a series of huge environmental fines, the Kochs also started lobbying in Washington and giving money to candidates at an almost unheard of level, not just to affect the top of the ticket, but even more so down ballot races, including state legislatures all across the country. Through this machinery, they created and disseminated a flood of dubious information that served their ideology and their interests, such as supply-side economics and skepticism about the reality of climate change. Denying the threat from global warming was a bread and butter issue for the Kochs, whose fortune depended on fossil fuels. Kurt Davies, the former research director at the progressive environmental group Greenpeace, spent months trying to trace the funds flowing into a web of nonprofit corporations and talking heads, all denying the reality of global warming as if working from the same script. What he discovered was that from 2005 until 2008, a single source, the Kochs, poured $25 million into dozens of different groups fighting climate reform. The sum was staggering. The two brothers had outspent the world's largest oil company, ExxonMobil, by a factor of 3. Another researcher, Robert Bruhl, a Drexel University professor, found in the first peer-reviewed study of the subject that between 2003 and 2010, over $500 million was spent on what he called a massive campaign to manipulate and mislead the public about the threat posed by climate change. The only explanation that the environmentalist Robert Mann could provide me when I asked why the US, unlike every other country in the world, was retreating from action on climate change was the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on disinformation by fossil fuel interests, including the Kochs. Now, the Kochs' political efforts have gone through many stages. In 2003, they came up with perhaps their best idea. Rather than funding their private political machine on their own, they began holding semi-annual summits at posh resorts with other hugely wealthy conservatives in hopes of pooling the donors' cash for more impact. These secretive donor summits really became the Kochs' magic trick, a force multiplier using other people's money. By doing so, they created, in essence, a rich people's movement. This group's war chest exerted an almost magnetic pull on the Republican Party, drawing candidates towards the big donors' views. These elite donors arguably pulled the party away from its base, leaving many ordinary voters feeling overlooked and resentful. It was a perfect opening for a populist disruptor like Trump. As has been well chronicled, Trump was the one Republican candidate who didn't seek the Koch support in 2016 or receive it. In fact, Charles Koch described the choice between Trump and Clinton as like the choice between cancer and a heart attack. A funny thing happened, though, after Trump won. There was a billionaire's rapprochement with him. David Koch, to everyone's surprise, showed up to attend the victory party for Trump. Soon, Koch operatives were running the transition team, and then much of the Trump administration. Trump may have run as a populist, but he has governed as the plutocrat's dream. Tim Phillips, the head of the Koch's political group, Americans for Prosperity, admitted that, to his surprise, there was, as he put it, almost no daylight between Trump and themselves. And if you step back, you can see that while the Kochs might have disavowed Trump, in several respects, he was their natural heir. For 40 years, they propagated the message through countless think tanks and academic programs that outsiders and businessmen are better suited to govern than those with experience. They also subsidized groups that attacked the credibility of the mainstream media and academics and neutral fact-based scientists. Whether they meant to or not, they set the table for the takeover of the world's most powerful country by a man who made his inexperience, his antipathy towards government, and his war on the truth into selling points. This showdown between fact and fiction reached a natural and fitting conclusion in this week's election. where the president was left defying the reality of his own defeat. But while Trump may be forced into exile, the forces that propelled him to power, including propaganda networks such as Fox News and unregulated, falsehood-laden social media platforms, and secret political donors who can manipulate the debate, remain with us. But there is, despite all of this, some good news. America's free press, in my view, has never performed more admirably. Our civil society, meanwhile, has held strong. Members of the news media may have been taunted, but we've not been arrested or silenced. And in fact, several major news organizations, including The New Yorker and The New York Times, are doing better than they have in years. On the day after this year's election, November 4th, 2020, The New York Times broke a record for traffic to its website with 120 million readers. Despite the challenging climate created by President Trump's disdain, journalists have rarely worked harder or done better or more vital work. And in the end of the day, I am betting that democracy and the facts that sustain it, not the alternative ones, but the real ones, will win. It may take a fight, and it may not happen overnight. But already there's a move afoot towards a serious reckoning in Washington. After the disgrace of Watergate, reformers rewrote the rules to require more disclosure and tighter limits on the amount of money going into campaigns. They also instituted strict new oversight of the executive branch to try to put the brakes on future corrupt presidents. There's already a bipartisan push for additional reforms, particularly when it comes to cleaning up political money. Among the proposals are to require future presidential candidates to disclose their tax returns, and to bar presidents from managing any private business or blind trust. There are also proposals to crack down on philanthropic loopholes so that billionaire extremists like the Kochs can't hide their political manipulations as tax-deductible charities. It's clear from this last election that there's far to go. It's hard to be upbeat about the chasm that clearly divides our hyper-partisan tribes. It's a tough challenge for the news media to bridge these two Americas, particularly when many news organizations, including local newspapers, are in a state of financial collapse. But what rings in my ears every so often are the words of a longtime Koch Industries employee named Phil DeBose, who I interviewed for my book, Dark Money. At the risk of personal ruin, even though he was just a middle-class guy from Louisiana living in a small house with a couple of hound dogs, he testified as a witness in a trial against the company's atrocious record of pollution and fraud. To the surprise of many, despite marshaling all of the resources of their multi-billion-dollar fortunes, the Koch brothers were found guilty and forced to pay a record-breaking fine. We won, Phil DeBose told me, because they didn't have a weapon as big as the one we used. What was that? I asked him. He answered in two simple words: the truth. Thanks very much for having me here. It's great to be able to address you. Now I'd really like to take some questions from the students at Rowland Hall.
Hi, I'm Kavitha. I'm an 8th grader at Rowland Hall. And Ms. Mayor, my question to you was, why do we pick the presidents off the electoral vote instead of the popular ones? And do you think that will change anytime soon?
That's a really good question. The Electoral College is the legacy of slavery in this country. It was devised as a compromise in order to get the Southerners to sign on to the Constitution. And so it has sort of persisted as a means of the South holding on to more power. And for that reason, I think we're going to have a very hard time doing away with it. It obviously favors states with smaller populations in rural areas over the highly populated big cities. And what it's really going to take is the areas that have an unfair amount of power deciding that they're ready to give it up. And that doesn't happen every day in politics. So I think it may be a long wait.
Hi, I'm JoJo. I'm an 8th grader at Rowland Hall. Miss Mayor, I was wondering, do you ever think in the future we would have a female president?
Thanks so much for the question. A female president. Well, we're one step closer, it appears, now that we have a female vice president. And so it seems that at least one glass ceiling is shattering. Though I have to say, I came away from the 2016 campaign feeling that there is a lot more resistance in this country to electing a woman than I had ever imagined before. It's going to be a hard hurdle to leap over, but obviously Kamala Harris is a big step forward.
Hi, I'm Sophie Dow, and I'm a senior at Rowland Hall. Miss Mayor, I was wondering, your book, Dark Money, The Hidden History of Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right, discusses how Trump's 2016 election was a victory for billionaires. How do you think billionaires played a role in this election?
Thanks so much for the question about the billionaires. Billionaires played a big role in this election, and not just billionaires on the Republican side. I mean, the amount of money that was spent on the 2020 presidential election is staggering. It appears to be almost, and probably more when it's all done, than $14 billion. And what we've seen is billionaires from both sides just pouring money into it. And, in some ways that's created more equality ideologically than when it was mostly Republicans who were really pouring the money into these elections. But I don't think it's a healthy situation to have billionaires of any stripe and any party overwhelming the ordinary voters and the ordinary donors in this country.
Hi, I'm Hattie Wall. I'm a senior at Rowland Hall. And my question for Ms. Mayor is, will Trumpism continue once he's out of office, as there's evidence that he may continue to fuel the movement even when he's gone?
Thanks so much for the question. There's been quite a bit of debate and forecasting on whether Trumpism will outlive Trump. And the public, most of the public opinion seems to be on the side of Trump continuing to be a powerful force even when he's out of office. Many people suggest that he may have some sort of TV presence, maybe his own network or platform, and that he will continue to have a hold on his base. I actually disagree somewhat with that. I think there's a possibility he's going to be in very hot water legally and financially, and that's not going to play out well for him. And I also think that, he's going to be the one thing that he has had the least respect for, which is a loser. And usually losers in American politics don't hold on to their power. So we shall see. But it was a great question. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you to the Rowland Hall students. Jane, thank you for answering their questions. Again, I loved all of those smart questions. You've done your homework. You should feel very good about that. So thank you for participating in that. As we wrap up this event, I want to say a very special thank you to our guest, Jane Mayer. Jane, I'm sorry you weren't able to actually be right next to me, but we did have to practice social distancing, and I hope 3,000 miles away was the proper call. I also wanted to thank our friends at the Boston Globe, Marjorie Pritchard and the Boston Globe Foundation, our friends at Westminster College, including especially President Beth Dobkin. We had many people who participated in our national jury to judge the essays, as well as our local people here in Utah. I want to say thank you to all of them. A special thank you to Mary Kay Lazarus, and also, as always, our friends here at Rowland Hall for making this event happen. As we conclude today's event, keep in mind a couple of things. The first is this: government of the people, for the people, and by the people. Now, the COVID-19 virus doesn't know that that's the norm, but you do, or at least you should. Please, take 10 minutes every day, read the Constitution, read the Bill of Rights. Those are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. stay safe, wear your mask, and we will see you again this time next year. Thank you all for participating. Please drive safely, stay healthy.